Today I want to have another look at seeding and the opportunities at the break of the season. So a lot of this, people will be familiar with a lot of the things that I'm saying, but I think it's really important to get this information out there and to create an opportunity to have a conversation about how we manage the break of the season. Firstly, the key messages. It's really obvious that moist sowing opportunities limit the size and the earliness of most low rainfall seeding programs. The dry sowing, our experience is that dry sowing gets crops sown and emerged earlier at the risk of seedling exposure to severe water deficits, drought. Third one, chasing moisture, following moisture down in the soil as the soil dries, increases the number of sowing opportunities and limits our exposure to these soil water deficits. The final point is that soil type really matters. In terms of objectives, what am I trying to do here? We're trying to seed much bigger programs earlier. That's what people are trying to do. We're trying to get reliable crop establishment in a wide range of seasonal types, and we're trying to do that at the same time as containing our machinery costs, which are a really major driver of the economy, the profitability of cropping programs. So the scope of the study, I'm limiting it to just looking at seeding opportunities and seedling performance, and not worrying particularly about crop potential given a seeding opportunity. So we're just saying, was there an opportunity to seed on this day, and what happened to the seedlings? I'm focusing on low rainfall environments, and I'm focusing on a very wide sowing season, much wider than we normally would, going from the 10th of April to the 19th of July. So I'm giving ourselves a maximum chance of getting seeding opportunities in a fairly long run of years, 57 to 2010. What are we dealing with here? We're dealing with two major sets of processes. The first one is conditions for seeding. It happens in the seed zone, 0 to 10 centimetres, right at the surface of the soil. What's the driver? Water availability in the seed bed. The biology, the plant things that matter here are changes in seed viability, seed deterioration in the seed bed, germination and emergence of seedlings. The second set of processes we're interested in are conditions for seedlings. That relates to what happens in the seedling zone or the topsoil, 0 to 20 centimetres. What are the drivers here? Once again, water availability in the topsoil. What's the biology that matters? Seedling survival and seedling development and growth. How seedlings perform. So what did we do? In this study, we simulated soil water balance on both a deep sand and a loamy duplex soil between the 1st of January and 19th of July. So we've got soil water data, historical sequences of soil water data. We assessed the water availability for the seedling processes, the seeding processes in the seedbed, and the seedling processes in the topsoil on each day between the 10th of April and the 19th of July. And then we took that soil water availability and used that to assess conditions for seeding and seedlings. Firstly, I just want to go back and refresh people's memory about soil water balance and what we're trying to do here. Soil water balance is just basically trying to balance inputs of water with outgoings of water given the storage of water in the soil. And we've got a wide range of processes that we have to account for. That's why we just don't use rainfall. These other processes matter. So if we look very carefully at the soil and what happens in the soil in terms of storing water, this picture is a picture which shows what happens in terms of soil water content with depth in terms of soil water availability. So if we look at these layers, 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 20, and so on, the amount of water in the soil when it's air dry is this line here, about 2.5%. as the soil wets up, or as the amount of water in the soil increases, we get to the stage here, the crop lower limit, which is the water content of the soil that the crop can extract water down to. And the water available in the soil between the lower limit and the upper limit, the drained upper limit, which is the amount of water in the soil if that soil just drains by gravity. So if we take this relationship between water content and availability, this red zone here is water that's in the soil between the lower limit and 10% plant available, which is really, that amount of water is very difficult for plants to get to. And plants, once the water level gets down to that level, plants start to die. This yellow zone, if water gets into that zone, water's difficultly available for the plants and they're disabled, they slow down in growth. If water's in this zone, the blue zone, if the water content's in this zone, then plants freely available, the water's freely available to plants, it's not a problem for them. If we classify from the seeding and seedling processes, classify the soil water content in the topsoil or the seed bed and the topsoil, we can in relation to these water contents, we can say when the soil is really dry in the topsoil and the seed bed, we'll call that red. It's dry. If it's almost dry, these are times where there's water available in the soil, but difficultly available. We call that almost dry. This situation here, the light blues, are situations where the seed bed's dry, it's dry at the surface, but moist in the topsoil. So there's water underneath. And your ideal seeding conditions here, it's moist in the seed bed, wet in the seed bed, and it's moist in the topsoil. Good seeding conditions. If I apply this structure of water availability across years, so we've got years across here by days of the year here, we can see for each year, if I classify every day, I can say whether on this day, was the soil dry? Was it all red? Was it almost dry? Yellow? Was it dry at the surface but had some water in it? Light blue? Or was it really ideal, good seeding conditions, this dark blue colour? I can look at the whole 5,000 odd days and get a picture of what our seeding opportunities looked like. So typically, the soil gets wet with a rainfall event, and then it gets dark blue with a rainfall event, then it starts to dry out from the surface, goes light blue, then it'll go to yellow to red, possibly. So looking at that whole picture in this deep sand, about 14% of the days in this period are dry. It's really rare, and it doesn't happen every year, that you get red conditions here after the 10th of April. 28% of this picture, are yellow. It's almost dry. Ideal seeding opportunities are only happening in about 24% of those days, the dark blue ones. And I want to concentrate on those at the moment. So this is looking at all the dark blue, the really good seeding opportunities on a deep sand at Mullewa through time. About 24%. What you notice immediately is that there's huge variation in the length of sowing runs. At Mullewa on a deep sand, you can get really long sowing runs, like this one here, of 20 odd days, when it's really good seeding conditions in the soil. But you also get whole years where you get 1 and 2 day runs when it's really good, and then the soil's dry again. This is a really familiar situation in the sand at Mullewa. So let's start putting some numbers around this. And the way to look at these numbers is that for each day, so by the 30th of April, in 10% of years, I have had less than 0 days, so no sowing opportunities. So 90% of years on the 30th of April, I've had less than 3 days of really ideal sowing conditions at Mullewa. In 90% of years, I've had less than 3 days by the 30th of April. I don't get very many really good wet sowing opportunities early. So if I follow this argument along and come to the 9th of June, in 50% of years, these years, by the 9th of June, I've had less than 9 days of these really ideal seeding opportunities. And for many people, at this stage, they've closed their sowing window at Mullewa, finished. So in half the years, they're only going to get 10 of these really good sowing opportunities. If we take that even further and say, okay, I'll extend the sowing window out to the 29th of June, in 10% of years, I've got less than 10 days by the 29th of June. And if we look at when those years are, here they are down here, 2006 with 2 days, 1977, 2007, 1971, and 2000, 2001, similar. We've got 5 years in here, in this 50 years, where I've got less than 10 days ideal wet sowing at Mullewa in a sand. And let me tell you, it gets worse if we start to look at a clay. So what's the there's not enough wet sowing days. So what's the consequence of taking these opportunities for what happens to seedlings? If I look after every single one of these sowing events, look after it later in the season, and say, how often do I run into yellow conditions where there's a bit of a water limitation in the soil after seeding, disabling conditions if you like. In these conditions it might just be a reduction in growth. In 56% of all these days we ran into disabling conditions after sowing, and in 50% of those there was more than 9 days of disabling conditions after sowing. So what I'm saying is water stress, water deficit after sowing, even in ideal sowing conditions, is a common feature of what happens to seedlings on deep sands at Mullewa. If we go further than that and take seedling conditions that were lethal, in other words, it went after it got a blue, after an ideal seeding opportunity, somewhere in here it went red. The soil dried out to the level where water was really hard for the seedlings to get, 0 to 20 centimetres. Only 1% of those ran into those sort of situations. But they were long, like you lost a crop. Unusual on a sand, but it does happen in the record. Where's the opportunity to get more sowing days? There is an opportunity if we chase moisture. So these light blue ones are days when the surface of the soil, 0 to 10 centimetres, was dry, but there was plenty of water in the topsoil, 0 to 200. In other words, 10 to 20 centimetres, there was a fair bit of water. 2 ways we can get at that. We can chase it. So we can go moisture-seeking sowing, which is not common here, or we can seed into the dry topsoil and call it a dry sowing. So we're dealing with 34% of all these sowing days. So we're going to get a fair few more days by going here. In fact, in 50% of years, I get 33 more days by taking account of these sowing opportunities where there's a dry surface and moisture in the soil. In other words, somewhere in the summer the soil is wet up, at least to 20 centimetres, and it's dried down from the surface. So I got the days I needed. If I look at this figure, which is the number of planting days, number of planting days I've got by a date, I can see in 50% of years by the 9th of June, I've got 25 seeding days now. I've got a fair chance of getting a whole program in. Still got to worry here though, because in 10% of years, even taking account of these guys, by the 9th of June, I've had less than 8 days. So there's still 5 years in there with less than 8 days of this sort of sowing conditions by the 9th of June. Still got a big problem in terms of getting seeding opportunities. What did I have to give up to do that? I've had a slight increase in the incidents, situations where I ran into these disabling water conditions after seeding, and virtually no change in lethal. So by adding situations where it was dry at the surface, plenty of water in the soil, deeper, I'm not changing my exposure to lethal conditions, and there's a slight change in my exposure to disabling conditions for the seedling. Not a big problem. But I'm still short of days. So let's have a look at these dry seeding opportunities. So this is looking at the red 14%, the really dry soil, and the yellow ones here, which are the situations where there's water in the soil, but not a lot of it for seedlings. So there's plenty of these days at Mullewa. We're going to have no shortage of dry seeding days at Mullewa. And that's pretty clear from this figure, which is the same as the blue seeding graph. I've got heaps of these days. And if I dry seed on these days, and I germinate, say, on 7 millimetres of rain after seeding, dry sowing, I get, in 50% of these opportunities, I'm going to get 10 days of dry sowing up by the 17th of May, so I'm really going to get them up early. At what cost? If I dry seed, take advantage of these dry seeding opportunities, it's almost certain that I'm going to run into, the seedlings are going to run into some disabling conditions, that they're going to run into conditions where water's going to limit them. More worrying, and this is in a sand, is that in 16% of all these sowing opportunities, I'm running into lethal conditions. So seedlings are going to start dying. This is not necessarily negative. I think people who dry sow are quite prepared to tolerate mortality of seedlings. They don't like it, but it's still not a big problem. So in summary, for the sand, we've got problems getting enough wet sowing days. This analysis is definitely showing that, and that's what experience says. The chasing or seeking moisture, situations where we've got dry surface and moist underneath, can get us those seeding days without going near dry seeding, dry seeding. There's no question, there's plenty of opportunities to dry sow, but there's a big penalty for dry sowing. So dry sowing has been really propagated on the sands, but what happens if we go to a different soil type? If I go to a loamy duplex soil, a heavy land soil, the water characteristics are quite different. It stores a lot more water, so the plant available water holding capacity is much greater. There's a bit of a tax in terms of this air dry to lower limit. We have to wet up the soil before the plant can see any water, and that's a tax of somewhere around 5 to 8 millimetres to get your soil from this loamy duplex soil from air dry to a state where the plants can get any water at all. So quite different water holding characteristics. So what difference does it make? So we're looking here at the deep sand, and this is the loamy duplex soil, the heavy land. First thing you notice is there's a hell of a lot more red on the loamy duplex. 30% of that picture is red, is dry, compared to 14% over here, which we saw before. If we add up the red ones and the yellow ones, so all of the dry situations, on the loamy duplex, half the days in there are dry. 10% more than on the sand. So, heavy land, it spends a lot of its time dry in the break of the season. What about the ideal seeding opportunities? On heavy land, we've actually got more of them, more days more of that picture is dark blue. The other interesting thing, which is our experience on heavy land, is that the runs of seeding, these ideal seeding conditions, are much longer. Why is that? We've got a soil that stores more water in the surface. So for a given rainfall event, that more water can be held in that surface layer where we're trying to seed. That's why we've got more of those opportunities there. The other notable bit is that there's a lot less of this dry surface stuff in the heavy land. That it happens in the sand, but in the heavy land, because there's more water that needs to evaporate to get to that situation, we don't see it as often. So quite a different environment in terms of the overall resource that we're dealing with. If we look at the seeding opportunities, the moist sowing opportunities, all of them, we'll see in the heavy land that we're still chasing days here. We've still got a problem with moist sowing opportunities on heavy land. The notable thing is the change in lethal. You'll remember in the sand it's about 1% of the opportunities. In the heavy land we're up to 10% now. So it's starting to get significant. So comparing the two, so this is the sand versus the loamy duplex, light land versus heavy land. You can see changes in sowing days.